China-Canada ties. We are joined by Dan McClory, live from Irvine, California. He is the president and head of China for Boustead and Company, a private equity fund. Dan, thanks for joining us. We see that China and Canada have said they'd like to see trade between the two countries double by 2025. Can you put this into perspective for us? How substantial a goal is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on the show, Karina. I appreciate it. So right now, there's about 60 billion Canadian dollars worth of trade between the two countries. So that's taking it in 10 years up to 120 billion. Now, as the current Prime Minister Trudeau pointed out, it has not been the most stable of relationships between the countries. Of course, we can look back to his father, who actually reopened diplomatic relations with China 2 years before the U.S. did in 1970. I think there is going to be significant progress. I think we've heard a willingness on his part to do that, but it's not going to be without obstacles. I think there are some major areas that the two countries will be focusing on where both would like to achieve some advantage relative to each other in going into those countries.
All right, Dan, now you're touching on some of the sticking points. What, in your opinion, are the sticking points in that relationship right now?
So right now you have essentially excuse me, a large imbalance between the countries. So Canada is basically importing 3 times as much from China as it exports to China. So right away you're going to look at that. And this is not unlike many large industrialized countries throughout the world that China does business with. So admittedly, Canada is going to be looking for a way to be able to really garner some advantage and to be able to give its economy a lift. And 2 areas come to mind. I mean, one is certainly in the area of farming and agricultural products. Another is financial services. So the insurance companies and pension plans in China that would really like to get going with some investing activity in China, they're looking for opportunities to do that.
Dan, so you mentioned that imbalance. Of course, Canadians are going to want to see more access to the Chinese market. Do you think that's likely to happen?
Yes, I think it is, and I think we're going to see it in a few different ways. I mean, I think if there's a breakthrough of sorts that's already come about as a result of these talks, it has to do with a tiny little seed called canola, and it's a product that Canada exports about $2 billion a year to China. And China was considering some fairly strong restrictive measures on that particular seed, which is used in cooking oil and agricultural products. In fact, China has decided that they are going to put off any renegotiation or tightening of restrictions until a larger, longer-term agreement can be put into place. That's one area,
now, Dan,
of course, for Canada.
So that's one area. Right, a substantial one, definitely, as it was a strong sticking point. Now, talks have also reportedly begun on a potential free trade pact between the two countries. Now, we all know that free trade agreements are often controversial. Look at what's happening to the TPP here in the U.S. In Canada, there has been some who have voiced concern that this would benefit China more than Canada. Do you agree with that statement?
I don't on the surface, but I will say that there is some relatively strong opposition in Canada, despite the 80% approval rating that we heard about from the Montreal commentator, from the automotive industry. That's an industry within Canada that's very much lobbying to not see this free trade take place. Of course, the free trade from the China side inbound to Canada would also center around natural resources and having less government intervention, less restrictive policies there. And again, that's a bit controversial in Canada as well.
Mm-hmm. And then 4 new business deals were also announced during Li Keqiang's visit. Which one is the most substantial in your view?
Well, I think by far it's got to be the nuclear reactor deal. So a Canadian consortium, which is participating with China Nuclear, has signed an agreement where they are going to be able to take and reuse the water that's being used from the reactors. It's going to start out on 33 reactors in China, but both sides see this as a great opportunity to take that combined approach, that joint venture that has Canadian technology inside, and go throughout the world in many, many other places where China is doing business with nuclear energy. So I think that is the most significant, it's the most scalable and repeatable.
Right, Dan. So we're running a little bit out of time, but I just want to get your last thought on what would you say the relationship between the two countries, how it has changed since the new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has come into power, just very briefly.
So it's changed, I think, somewhat dramatically. Under the prior conservative government, there was even some anti-Chinese legislation that had to do with restrictions on businesses coming into Canada. And as we've heard from Prime Minister Trudeau, he's really pushing that aside, and that's out the window. There's also been a very cordial interplay between Lee and Trudeau, which is interesting to see. We, of course, heard the earlier comments, but I think there's been a strong reset and a signaling of a reset that also has some populist support, unlike other countries in the world that may not. But there is a good degree of populist support in Canada. Canada sees real estate being purchased, Chinese students coming in to be educated, agricultural products being exported. So I think Canada's taking a very realistic and an open approach to relaunching its trade relationship with China.
A strong reset in that relationship. Thank you so much. That was Dan McClory of Boustead and Company, President and Head of China.